Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he is going to enter Rafah no matter what, deal or no deal. And now Hamas is asking, well, if you're going to enter anyway, why should we sign this ceasefire deal if it's just going to be temporary?
Israel's defense minister has accused Hamas of not being serious about reaching agreement on a ceasefire and has threatened to launch its attack on the city of Rafah if the talks collapse. It comes on another day of talks in Cairo to try to agree a truce in which a 40-day pause is being discussed to allow the release of hostages. The main sticking point appears to be whether the truce will be permanent, as Hamas insists, or not. Meanwhile, Israel's government has moved to shut down the operations of the Al Jazeera television network in the country, claiming it is a mouthpiece for Hamas. Well, let's talk to Jasmine El-Gamal, former Middle East advisor at the US Department of Defense. And during her tenure at the Pentagon, she advised on various crises in the Middle East. Good afternoon to you, Jasmine.
Good afternoon, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you with us. What's your understanding of where these talks to try to reach an agreement on ceasefire have reached?
Right. So these negotiations obviously have been ongoing for months, and the parameters of the deal and the issues have been pretty much the same for the last several months. Now, the biggest issue is the length of a proposed ceasefire. Now, the two sides, Hamas on one side and Israel, represented by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the other side, they both started out with extremely maximalist positions. Hamas said there has to be a permanent ceasefire now, full withdrawal from Gaza forever. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu saying the exact opposite. Now, various developments have been made over the last few months on this issue, with proposals suggesting different pauses in the fighting, different lengths of pauses in the fighting, to try to get the two parties closer together, because this really is the most stubborn sticking point, I would say, in the negotiations. The other big one is the prisoner and hostage release. So for every hostage released by Hamas, Hamas is demanding a certain number of Palestinians to be released as well, both prisoners who have been charged with crimes, as well as Palestinians who have been held without charge in Israeli prisons. And the last issue, of course, is freedom of movement of Gazans from the south back to their homes in the north. Now, the issue that is really sticking the negotiations right now is this idea of the ceasefire. Over the weekend and throughout the last few days, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he is going to enter Rafah no matter what, deal or no deal. And now Hamas is asking, well, if you're going to enter anyway, why should we sign this ceasefire deal if it's just going to be temporary?
And we've also then heard Israel's defense minister, part of Netanyahu's war cabinet, reinforcing that message, saying that this attack on Rafah, which the US, the UK and many other allies have warned against, that will go ahead. I mean, those kind of words at this delicate stage of the negotiations seem almost certain to scupper a deal.
Absolutely. It almost feels like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that Netanyahu doesn't want a deal, because Hamas has made positive signals over the weekend, whereas the Israeli prime minister didn't even send a delegation to Cairo to discuss the deal. And so what Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing right now within Israel is this really difficult, almost impossible balancing act that he's trying to achieve. Excuse me. He's basically trying to appease the right-wing coalition partners in his government and trying to stand firm for them in order so that they don't walk out of his government by saying, I will never concede to Hamas. We are going into Rafah no matter what. On the other hand, he's also trying to save face in front of the hostage families who have been begging him for months to get to a deal so that their families can come home. And as we know, more and more hostages are dying by the day because of the conditions in Gaza, the bombardment, the fact that they're being held by Hamas. under these conditions. And what he's trying to do is tell the hostage families, it's not my fault that there's no deal. Hamas is the one saying no. And so he's trying to do these two things at once, which, like I said, is an impossible balancing act.
And just remind people listening about the significance of Rafah, because this is a city in the south of Gaza where there are already well over 1 million refugees. But Israel has also repeatedly been saying it is almost the last holdout of the military members of Hamas.
That's right. And thank you so much for asking that question because it is a really important point. Now, throughout the war, since basically October 8th, when Israel started to retaliate for the attacks of October 7th, Israel has been pushing, trying to basically clear one part after the next throughout the Gaza Strip. So started out with the north in the beginning of the war, cleared that area, told people to move down south. They moved to an area called Khan Yunis, which is sort of in the middle, and then from Khan Yunis moved to Rafah. So for the past couple of months, you've had basically almost half of the population of the entire Gaza Strip in Rafah, about 1.2 million people, most of them displaced from other parts of Israel. They're living in tents, obviously horrid conditions. They're on the verge of famine, have been for quite some time, and getting very little assistance in the way of food, medicine, and other critical life-saving assistance. That said, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF is also saying that there are remnants of Hamas battalions or remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah who have escaped from the north to the south, and that's who they want to go after.
And
Now,
let me just ask you, Jasmine, because we don't have a huge amount of time yet left. I just wanted to ask you about this decision by the Israeli government to shut down the operations of the Al Jazeera TV network. Their offices have been raided. Al Jazeera, of course, has denied Israel's claims that it's a threat to security as a dangerous and a ridiculous lie. I mean, what do you make of this?
well, first and foremost, it's a really egregious attack on freedom of the press. I mean, this is a station that is, yes, it is operated out of Qatar and funded by Qatar. It is a state-owned network, but Qatar is also one of the mediators of this deal that the Israelis are trying to get to. And to do something like this, when Qatar is trying to mediate that deal and get the hostages home, seems fairly aggressive on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that's just speaking from diplomatic terms, not as just a basic freedom of the press issue. Now, Al Jazeera is the largest TV station across the Arab world. Nearly every person in the Arab world who has a TV set looks to Al Jazeera for news, and they do show things that aren't normally shown in other stations, such as statements from Hamas, videos from Hamas showing attacks on Israeli soldiers and so on. And that's why Israel is saying it's a threat to national security, saying it's a mouthpiece for Hamas, whereas Al Jazeera is just saying we're reporting the news as it's happening.